Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. It's good to have you here watching. My guest this time is actually myself, Bruce Gagnon, and we're going to be talking about President Trump's new proposal to create a new branch of the military called the Space Force. And since I've been working on space issues, trying to prevent Star Wars since 1983, we decided that I would have my friend Regis Tremley here, who lives in Brunswick, and he's going to ask me a series of questions. Regis, thanks for being here.
Always good to be with you, Bruce.
Take it away.
Fire away. Well, everything in the news today is about the new Space Force and Trump wanting to spend millions and millions on that. And that's a direct confrontation to Russia again, and the rest of the news is about Russia. So I think what I'd like to know is what's the origin of the United States plan for space warfare, and did the Nazis that the U.S. brought here after World War II in Operation Paperclip have anything to do with the origins of that program?
Okay, let me first start by saying it's not going to be millions and millions, it's going to be billions and hundreds of billions, a massive amount of money to pay for this kind of thing. The U.S. space program was essentially created by the Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, who made Hitler's V-1 and V-2 rockets towards the end of World War II. And after the war was over, Operation Paperclip, the United States illegally smuggled 1,500 of the top Nazi operatives from intelligence, from space, Air Force medicine, and the rocket program, smuggled them into the United States. They brought 100 copies of the V-2 rocket, 100 of Wernher von Braun's chief scientists and engineers, brought them to Huntsville, Alabama to create the U.S. space program. One of them was Major General Walter Dornberger, who was Hitler's liaison between Hitler and von Braun. He was the intermediary running that whole V-1 and V-2 rocket operation. Dornberger came to the United States, became vice president of Bell Aerospace in New York, and testified before the Congress of the United States, laying out the vision, orbiting battle stations, destroying other countries' satellites, hitting targets on the earth below. This is what he said we would be doing in the years to come. So clearly, as we look at the program today that has been under development since Ronald Reagan, it's right along the lines of essentially what I call the Nazi prophecy.
Well, you mentioned Ronald Reagan, and that's probably the first time that Americans ever heard the word Star Wars or Space Wars. How did this come about? How did an American president now, after how many? Since 1945 to 1986, how did that come about?
The United States was looking for an advantage. You remember during the Cold War, they called it MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. Both the US and the former Soviet Union each had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire planet. So nobody had an advantage. In a way, there was a kind of a strange stability that came from that because neither side had an advantage. But the US still wanted an advantage. And they knew that if they could create a shield that would allow the US to hit Russia or hit China in a first strike, take out as many of their nuclear weapons as possible, whatever they fired in retaliatory strike afterwards could then be taken out by this Star Wars shield, giving the US an advantage. And so that was always the purpose of it. And so Ronald Reagan came out with that program. And you might recall during that period, he was meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev, the former leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev agreed to get rid of all of the Soviet Union's nuclear missiles. The US would get rid of theirs. They'd get rid of them all. But you can't have Star Wars. And the United States said, no, we got to have Star Wars. And so that's why disarmament didn't happen during that period of time.
So it's no secret to the Russian Federation today that the United States has this first strike policy public. But Americans, I don't think, realize that, do they?
No, in fact, the U.S. Space Command every year has a computer war game where they practice. They call it the red team versus the blue team. And they practice a first strike attack on Russia and China. And in that, they launch their nuclear attack on Russia and China, try to take out as many of their systems as possible, air, land, and sea. And then when they fire their retaliatory capability, a new system that's been introduced in recent years called missile defense, the SHIELD, is used to pick off their retaliatory strike. Now, there used to be a treaty between the United States and Russia that banned missile defense, again, because everybody knew that it would give one side an advantage over the other. But when George W. Bush became president, he immediately withdrew the United States from the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and escalated the research, development, testing, and now deployment of the missile defense system. When Obama came into office, he accelerated that program. So Republicans and Democrats have worked together over many, many years, since the early 80s, to push this whole program forward.
So here's a question. NASA. Is NASA strictly a civilian program, or does it have another purpose as well? Because we're talking space. The only access to space we've had is NASA.
Well, the charter of NASA says that it will only be civilian. That was a way to sell it to the American people, because the American people didn't want to see a whole new arms race. American people pay for that, right? We pay for that with our tax dollars. So the American people weren't interested in that. But the truth of the matter is that all NASA missions have always been what they call dual use, meaning every mission is both military and civilian at the same time. So when they're flying to one place or the other, or when they're up there on the space station doing experiments, they're doing military experiments on all those missions. When they're mapping the surface of the moon, okay, they're developing technologies that allow them to map the surface of the Earth. And now with our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places today, the U.S. military has all these incredibly sophisticated Earth maps that they got from essentially NASA technology that was supposedly for civilian operations. So everything that NASA has ever done has been both military and civilian at the same time.
So they always say follow the money. Who's making money off of this, Bruce? I mean, I have to think it's the aerospace industry, the military-industrial complex. Are they the ones behind this and pushing this space war stuff?
That's right. You know, I guess all the way back to at least the 1990s, the aerospace industry has been saying that Star Wars, moving the arms race into space, would be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. Now just imagine that. In the history of Earth, I call it pyramids to the heavens. The aerospace industry are the pharaohs of our age, building the pyramids to the heavens, and we, the taxpayers, will be the slaves to turn over everything we have, all social progress, all indicators of better life, cleaning up the environment, funds for that, funds for dealing with the growing disparity of wealth in America and around the world. All those monies would be turned over to the aerospace industry. A few years ago, in one of the industry publications called Space News, they ran an editorial and they said, you know, we've got to be responsible corporate citizens. We've got to come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for all this stuff. And we have. And we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure that funding source. And they identified it. They said it's the entitlement programs that officially are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the welfare program. And so these are the programs that the aerospace industry has targeted for defunding in order to pay for the pyramids to the heavens. So if you listen closely today, you hear all the time, Oh, we're going to have to do something about Social Security. It's not sustainable. We're going to have to do something about Medicare, Medicaid. It's not sustainable. Yeah, they want to cut it and take that money and build a new arms race in space that'll make them rich beyond anything imaginable.
So you're one of the co-founders and you're the present coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. What role is nuclear going to have in this space program?
Well, for many, many years, I would go to Albuquerque, New Mexico every year to protest outside of a space nuclear power convention. It was organized by the University of New Mexico Nuclear Engineering Department. And at this event would come all the big aerospace corporations. They'd set up their fancy displays, Boeing and Raytheon and General Dynamics and all the rest of them. And they would talk about two things. They would talk about weapons in space that would be powered by nuclear reactors. And then they would talk about going out and mining the sky, mining the moon for helium-3 and water, mining Mars for magnesium and cobalt and uranium, mining the asteroids for gold and other minerals. And these mining colonies, they said, would be powered with nuclear reactors, so nuclear-powered mining colonies. And then in order to get to these places, because it takes a long time to get to Mars, and because of space radiation, by the time they get there, the astronauts' bodies would be like jello, okay? So that doesn't work. So they want to cut in half the amount of time it takes to get to Mars. So they said with nuclear reactors on board of spaceships, they would be able to cut in half the amount of time it takes to get to these places. So for some years, when I lived in Florida, I lived only an hour from the Space Center in Orlando, Florida. I was organizing protests at the Space Center in 1989 when NASA launched Galileo with plutonium-238 on board, the most deadliest toxic substance ever created by humanity. In 1990, Ulysses launched with, again, plutonium-238 on board. In 1997, organized protests against Cassini with 72 pounds, the most ever, plutonium on board. And in the environmental impact statement for the Cassini mission, NASA admitted that if there was a launch pad explosion and a release of the plutonium as dust, that the winds would carry it for a 60-mile radius from the Space Center west to Disney World, north to Daytona Beach, south to Vero Beach, Florida. 60 miles would be contaminated radius. And they would have to go in and remove all the people. And then the environmental impact statement said they'd have to go in and remove all the vegetation. And then they'd have to go in and remove all the animals. Can you imagine the rattlesnakes, the alligators, the birds, the fish, the squirrels? Unbelievable. And then they would have to remove all the buildings, all the structures. And then they said they would have to remove the top half-inch of topsoil because everything would be radioactive for thousands and thousands of years. Well, this is like nuclear Russian roulette, right? It's crazy. And so we've long, that's why our name, the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, we've long opposed the use of nuclear power on space missions because it's so dangerous. And there have been accidents over the years, both the United States and the former Soviet Union, when they launched some of these nuclear missions over the years, there have been accidents, and these things have fallen back to Earth and polluted the planet. In early 60s, the US launched a military satellite. The Pentagon launched it. It had 2 pounds of plutonium. It fell back to Earth, burned up on reentry, spread the plutonium as dust. And Dr. John Goffman, one of the founders of uranium, studied that particular accident and said he believes it's one of the major contributors to the cancers around the Earth today, that virtually everybody on the planet is breathing in that plutonium dust. So we can't allow nuclear power to be taken into space. But the industry, just like the weapons industry wants warfare in space because they can make money off it, the nuclear industry also wants to move their product into space.
So what was NASA and the military doing with this plutonium that they did get up into space? What was its purpose?
They used Galileo, Ulysses, and Cassini missions. They used it in a generator to generate onboard electricity for deep space missions. And their claim was that we can't use solar because we're going too far from the sun. We have to use nuclear power. But the European Space Agency showed, when they did a mission called Rosetta, they went way out beyond where NASA has gone, and they used solar power, showing that it in fact would work on a deep space mission, but that the decision-making process within NASA, the Department of Energy that does all the nuclear programs, it's completely controlled by the nuclear industry. When they launched Cassini in 1997, right before the launch, we got a hold of an article from the Santa Fe, New Mexico newspaper. There's a Department of Energy facility in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where they fabricated the plutonium generators for that Cassini mission. And the article said was that there were 244 cases of worker contamination when they were fabricating the plutonium generators for Cassini. So even before they launched, they were contaminating workers. There's always leaks of the plutonium into the air that gets into the local environment. It leaks into the water, gets into the water. And so at the various Department of Energy laboratories, Savannah River Plant in South Carolina, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, out there in Santa Fe, New Mexico. At all these places, there have been years and years of reports of contamination of water supplies and air supplies and workers. And so it's not just some theoretical possibility that there would be a nuclear launch accident, but in fact the whole production process of space nuclear power is deadly.
So you've spoken about the mining and the industrialization purposes of space. What about the warfare purposes? What are they cooking up in this space program? What are they going to be having to fight up there or use there to fight down here?
There already is a thing called the Space Command, U.S. Space Command, headquartered at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. And above their doorway, they have their logo that reads Master of Space. They wear it as a patch on their uniform. In the late 90s, they published a document called Vision for 2020. If you listen closely, just last week, Vice President Pence said we will stand up this new Space Force in 2020. Well, in this Space Command Vision for 2020, they said the United States will control space, we will dominate space, and we will deny other countries access to space to protect U.S. interests and investments in the space medium. So what they're saying is basically two things. We're going to use space technology. It allows us to see everything on the Earth, to hear everything on the Earth, because they can intercept all phone, fax, email communications. The NSA is spying on everybody with their satellite systems. They can target every place on the Earth. All warfare today is coordinated by military satellites. So no matter whether you're a troop on the ground, in a tank, on a plane, whatever, in a boat, everything is coordinated today by space technology. So if the United States dominates and controls space, that means it wins all the wars on the Earth. It controls the planet on behalf of corporate interests, not you and me, not the public, corporate interests. Oil, that's what we're talking about. Resources, water, all that stuff. That's what the conflicts are today. But secondly, if you control the pathway on and off the planet Earth with a space force, you get to decide who gets to go out and mine the sky, who gets to make money mining for gold on the asteroids and helium-3 and other things on the moon and Mars and everywhere else. You control the pathway on and off the Earth, and that's the second part of the agenda. On behalf of who? You and me again? Mr. and Mrs. Average Citizen? No, on behalf of the big corporations. So this is what it's about. It's about militarizing space, weaponizing space on behalf of corporate interests to ensure that they control the planet Earth and the heavens above.
So in terms of the militarization of space, I've heard a couple of things. I've heard that part of that vision for 2020 is to gain, which has always been part of military strategy, the high ground. And I've heard it said and seen videos where these strategists are saying in any war or conflict, if we have the high ground space, we control the battlefield. Is there such a thing as the rods of God?
Rods from God.
Rods from God.
It's orbiting battle stations. Remember what I told you at the beginning of the interview about Major General Walter Dornberger, Hitler's liaison between Hitler himself and Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist that created the V-2 rocket for Hitler at the end of World War II. Dornberger came to the United States, became a vice president at Bell Aerospace, and he testified before the Congress in the 1950s, saying, "Gentlemen, I didn't come to this country to lose the Third World War. I lost 2 already." And he talked about we've got to have orbiting battle stations that will allow us to control the Earth. Well, today, one of the systems being worked on by the Pentagon is called Rods from God. Orbiting battle stations that orbit the Earth like a satellite that have tungsten steel rods on them and would be fired from the satellite down to the Earth and could come at such high speeds they could penetrate under the ground and help destroy a Russian or Chinese underground nuclear silo or take out an entire city probably. And so these kind of systems are indeed under development and again are an enfleshment, if you will, of the Nazi prophecies that came from Walter Dornberger.
So all of this might sound great for an American, or protecting our interests, easy to convince the American people. I cannot believe that countries like Russia, China, North Korea, Canada, France, England are not a little bit intimidated by this. Is there anything afoot to create a treaty that would prevent exactly what you're talking about? The militarization of space, the keeping the mining of space private just for American corporations. Is there anything afoot that's moving in that direction?
There has been, going back many years, all the way back to the 1960s, an outer space treaty that said there can be no weapons of mass destruction in space. At the time, the United States and the former Soviet Union negotiated that treaty because they didn't want either side to put permanently in space orbiting nuclear weapons that could be used to fire to the Earth. So no weapons of mass destruction. But now today, that treaty is outdated, 1967. It's outdated because new technologies say that, well, they say basically these are not weapons of mass destruction today, like rods from God. That's a weapon of selective destruction. So it falls outside of the original treaty language. So for the last at least 25 years, Russia and China, with the help of Canada and other countries, have been going to the United Nations saying, let's develop a new treaty. Let's close the door to the barn before the horse gets out. Let's ban all weapons in space. It's called PAROS, P-A-R-O-S, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And every year it passes overwhelmingly in the General Assembly, and then it goes to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva for negotiation, and the US and Israel block it. And so the treaty is going nowhere. United States official position during Republican and Democrat administrations is, hey, there's no problem. We don't need a new treaty.
So, what do you suppose Russian President Vladimir Putin is thinking about this, and what might he be planning to counter it? Because you know, Russia for sure is trying to counter everything that the United States is doing.
Well, Russia and China both don't have the money or the technology. They're both at least 30 years behind the United States in space weapons technology development in general. But they have concentrated, not trying to match everything the United States does, but they've tried to concentrate on finding ways around the US system. And there is growing evidence that they're having success in developing new technologies that would find their way around the US system and not give the United States control and domination of space.
So, here's a big time question. Earlier, you told me how this aerospace industry was planning on robbing, raping Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the social safety net, the entitlement programs. Do you think that Russia and China, and maybe the rest of the world, can see that this might bankrupt the United States and it'll never happen anyway?
Well, I think it is bankrupting us today. Look around. The schools have fallen apart. Roads and bridges are collapsing. It's happening all around us. We don't have any money for anything anymore. So we've got to speak out now and say, no, we can't afford this Space Force.
So, as the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, what do you recommend in the last minute or so that we have that people do?
First of all, go to our website, spaceforpeace.org, spaceforpeace.org, and look at our video section. Watch some of the videos. Get other people to look at them. Help educate people around this whole thing. Also, every year in October, we have a week called Keep Space for Peace Week, October 6th through 13th this year. And we're going to be holding local protests and educational events all over the world. Organize something in your community to help bring this to the public's attention and awareness. Write a letter to the editor and say, I don't want my Social Security, I don't want my Medicare to be cut in order to pay for Trump's Space Force. That's all you need to say, but help us say that loudly. You want to beat Space Force? Fight for social progress and do it today.
Well, Bruce, that was really very informative and enlightening. I'm sure it's going to get a lot of attention with your audience and wherever it goes beyond that.
Thank you, Regis,
Yeah.
for coming on the show and helping me get all this out. And thank you for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get organized.